My parents always called me the dumb one, while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. On her graduation day, Dad announced she would inherit everything: a brand new Tesla and a $10 million mansion. I sat silently in the back row until a stranger walked in, handed me a sealed envelope, and whispered, "It is time they learn who you really are." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia and I am 29 years old. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta, image was absolutely everything to my parents. My mother, Valerie, cared more about her standing in her exclusive sorority and her position at our megachurch than she ever cared about my feelings. My father, Marcus, carried himself like a real estate mogul, demanding respect and projecting a lifestyle of absolute luxury. To the outside world, we were the pinnacle of Black excellence. But behind the custom mahogany doors of our estate, I was the designated failure. My younger sister, Imani, was the golden child who could do no wrong. She was beautiful, arrogant, and had just graduated from Harvard Law School. The evening of Imani's graduation party was designed to be the social event of the season. My parents had transformed their sprawling backyard into a lavish venue that looked like a scene from a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from the massive oak trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the perfectly manicured lawn. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne and upscale appetizers, blending gourmet caviar with elevated Southern cuisine. A live band played smooth jazz mixed with classic rhythm and blues, setting an atmosphere of unmistakable wealth. This was not just a celebration of a law degree. It was a calculated display of power and status meant to impress Imani's fiancé, Spencer. Spencer was a 30-year-old private equity manager from a family of old white money. He walked around my parents' home with a subtle air of superiority, a smug smile constantly playing on his lips. He loved playing the white savior to a successful Black family, treating my parents with a patronizing fondness that made my stomach turn. But my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on because his family name brought them the ultimate validation they so desperately craved. I was seated at table 14, the furthest table from the main stage, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I was placed alongside distant cousins and elderly relatives who rarely came around. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk suit, a piece I had commissioned in Paris, but to my family I was just the college dropout who wore weird clothes. 7 years ago, I had left my pre-med program to teach myself coding and build financial software. My parents had screamed that I was throwing my life away. My mother had literally packed my bags and told me I was a stain on our family's pristine reputation. Since that night, I had spoken to them only a handful of times. They invited me tonight only because keeping me away would raise too many questions among the church elders. The music faded as my father stepped up to the microphone, tapping his crystal champagne flute. The crowd of socialites, politicians, and church members fell silent. Marcus stood tall, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, puffing his chest out as he looked at Imani. "Today we celebrate excellence," he boomed, his voice echoing across the lawn. "We celebrate a young woman who embodies the very best of our family legacy. Imani, you have made us prouder than words can express. You went to Harvard and showed them what brilliance looks like. And as you prepare to marry Spencer and merge two great families, I want to make sure you start your new life with nothing but the best." The crowd murmured in anticipation. My father gestured to the driveway where spotlights suddenly illuminated a brand new, pristine white Tesla wrapped in a massive red bow. Imani gasped dramatically, covering her mouth with her perfectly manicured hands. But my father was not finished. "That is just for your daily commute." He laughed, soaking in the applause. "Spencer, your family has a long history of generational wealth. But we have our own legacy to pass down. Imani, your mother and I are officially transferring the deed to the $10 million Aspen estate into your name. It is your wedding gift, your sanctuary, and your inheritance." The applause was deafening. Imani threw her arms around Spencer, who smiled broadly and patted my father on the back. People cheered and toasted to their unbelievable generosity. I just sat there sipping my sparkling water, watching the charade unfold. I knew things that nobody else in that yard knew. Just then, the scent of heavy floral perfume washed over me. My mother Valerie slid into the empty chair next to me, her smile completely fixed for the cameras, but her voice a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "Look at you sitting here looking completely out of place," she muttered, keeping her teeth perfectly bared in a fake smile. "I told you to wear a proper gown, but you show up in this bizarre green outfit. Spencer's parents are sitting at the front table. They come from real generational wealth, Nia. Do not even think about approaching them and making us look like fools." I turned to look at my mother. Her eyes were hard and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "I have not said a word to anyone, Mom," I replied evenly. "Keep it that way," she hissed. "You humiliated this family when you dropped out of college 7 years ago to play on the internet. You ruined your own life. We always knew you were the dumb one, but I expected you to at least have some common sense. Now your sister is a Harvard lawyer marrying into a private equity dynasty. Do not open your mouth and ruin this for her. Just sit in the shadows where you belong and watch your sister shine. Maybe if you behave, I will ask Spencer to find you a receptionist job at his firm." She stood up, smoothing her expensive dress, and walked back toward the VIP tables, laughing loudly at a joke someone made, completely dismissing my very existence. She had no idea that her words had absolutely no power over me anymore. I did not feel hurt. I only felt a cold, sharp anticipation. The band started playing an upbeat song, and guests began making their way to the dance floor. Spencer leaned down to kiss Imani, his eyes briefly scanning the crowd, until they locked onto me sitting alone in the back. He offered me a slow, condescending smirk, raising his glass in my direction, as if to toast my pathetic existence from his high horse. I simply held his gaze and offered a tiny smile in return. Suddenly, there was a slight commotion near the entrance of the tent. Two of my father's hired security guards were trying to stop a man from entering. The man was in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Mr. Sterling, my personal wealth manager and head of legal counsel. He did not raise his voice or cause a scene. He simply handed the head of security a document that made the large man instantly step aside and lower his head respectfully. Mr. Sterling walked with quiet authority straight through the crowd of dancing socialites, ignoring the curious stares. He bypassed the VIP tables, bypassed my father, who was busy shaking hands, and walked directly to the back of the tent to table 14. He stopped beside my chair, bowing his head slightly. I noticed Spencer watching us from across the yard, his smug smile faltering just a fraction at the sight of this highly professional man, treating me with such deep respect. Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a heavy red envelope sealed with wax. He placed it gently on the table right next to my glass of sparkling water. He leaned down and his voice was a low, steady murmur perfectly audible over the music. "The wire transfer is complete," he whispered. $50 million is safely in your private account, Madam Chief Executive Officer. And the foreclosure documents for this property, as well as the Aspen estate, have been finalized. The papers are ready for your signature. It is time they learn who you really are." I let my eyes drift back across the perfectly manicured lawn, past the crystal chandeliers, and the catered feast, past my mother laughing with her sorority sisters and my father puffing his chest. My gaze settled back on Spencer, who was now staring at the red envelope with visible confusion. He had absolutely no idea that the $10 million Aspen mansion he was planning to move into no longer belonged to his future father-in-law. It belonged to me, and the very ground he was standing on was about to be pulled right out from under his feet. The jazz band shifted into a slower tempo, signaling the end of the formal speeches. I remained in my seat at the back of the tent, watching the crowd mingle and celebrate a lifestyle built entirely on smoke and mirrors. That was when Spencer made his move. He separated himself from the group of wealthy investors my father was desperately trying to impress, and walked deliberately toward my table. The angle of his approach cast a long shadow across my silk suit. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down uninvited, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. His pale blue eyes scanned my outfit with a mixture of amusement and thinly veiled disdain. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, interlacing his fingers in a textbook power pose he had likely practiced in front of a mirror for hours. Nia, we need to have a very grounded conversation about your current trajectory. Spencer began, his voice dripping with that specific brand of unearned authority. I know this evening is about celebrating Amani and her incredible achievements at Harvard, but as your future brother-in-law, I feel a certain responsibility to look out for you. I know things have not exactly panned out the way you hoped since you left school. The tech world is brutal even for people with actual degrees. Playing around with coding in a dark room is fine for a teenager, but you are pushing 30, Nia. It is time to join the real world. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, resting my hands on my lap. I am doing just fine, Spencer, I replied, my voice completely flat. He let out a short, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. That is the problem, Nia. You think you are doing fine because you do not understand how the real world operates. You are living in a bubble. My family has been in private equity for 4 generations. We understand wealth creation. We understand how to build a legacy. Your parents have done an exceptional job elevating themselves into the upper echelons of Atlanta society, but you are becoming a noticeable liability to their brand. And quite frankly, you are becoming a massive liability to Amani. She is about to enter a very elite circle. She will be attending charity galas, hosting political fundraisers, and mingling with my family's exclusive network. When people ask what her sister does, it is highly embarrassing for her to say, "You are doing odd computer jobs and living in a crumbling house." Spencer leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. But I am a problem solver, Nia. That is what I do. I fix broken assets. I spoke with my father yesterday and I pulled a massive favor for you. We have an opening at our downtown firm. It is a front desk receptionist position. You would be answering phones, greeting high net worth clients, and managing the executive coffee station. It is entry level, obviously, since you do not have the educational background for anything else. But it offers dental insurance and a steady paycheck. It would give you a respectable title. You could finally tell people you work in private equity. It is a tremendous opportunity to get you off the streets and into a professional environment. He sat back, crossing his arms with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly waiting for me to shower him with gratitude for his profound act of white saviorism. Before I could respond, the heavy scent of expensive perfume announced Amani's arrival. She glided over in her custom white dress, holding a crystal flute of champagne, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the ambient light. She placed a manicured hand on Spencer's shoulder, looking down at me with absolute pity. "I see Spencer is already sharing our good news with you," Amani said, her voice carrying that sharp, authoritative tone she had adopted since starting law school. "You really should take the job, Nia. It is a lifeline and you desperately need one. But we actually have another piece of business to discuss. It is about Grandma's house." I looked up at my younger sister. The modest house was the only place I had left after our parents threw me out into the cold 7 years ago. "What about the house, Imani?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. Imani sighed, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "You have been squatting there for years, Nia. It is a blight on the neighborhood. Spencer and I were driving through the area yesterday, and we realized the property has excellent zoning potential. The structure itself is a teardown, obviously. We are going to bulldoze the entire thing and build a modern pool house and a regulation tennis court. It will be the perfect addition to the new estate Dad just gave me. It will significantly increase the overall property value." "That house belongs to Grandma's trust," I stated simply. Imani rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, theatrical laugh. "Please, Nia, do not try to debate law with a Harvard graduate. Dad is the executor of the trust. I already drafted the transfer paperwork and he signed it this morning. Legally, you are a trespasser. I could have the sheriff forcefully evict you tomorrow morning. But I am not a monster. You are my sister, even if you are a massive disappointment. So here is my generous offer. If you pack your things quietly and vacate the premises by Friday, I will personally set up a monthly allowance for you. $500 a month. It is more than enough charity to help you rent a tiny studio apartment somewhere on the outskirts of the city. You can take the receptionist job Spencer so graciously offered and finally start acting like a functioning adult. She smiled a cold, calculated smile that perfectly mirrored our mother's expression. Think about it, Nia. You get a job and a steady allowance. All you have to do is disappear from our property and stop dragging the family name down. I looked back and forth between the two of them. Spencer with his inflated chest and stolen confidence. Imani with her shiny new degree and absolute lack of morality. They were perfectly matched in their grand delusion. Before I could deliver my response, a frantic voice interrupted us. "Excuse me, I am so sorry to interrupt." It was the general manager of the luxury catering company. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a cloth handkerchief, holding a sleek leather billfold. He looked wildly around the table, avoiding direct eye contact with Spencer. "What is the problem?" Spencer demanded, his tone instantly shifting from fake concern to aggressive entitlement. "Can you not see we are having a private family discussion? Go find a waiter if you need something." The manager swallowed hard, his hands visibly shaking, holding the leather folder. "Sir, I apologize, but I urgently need to speak with Marcus. I have been trying to locate him for the past 20 minutes, but he keeps walking away when he sees me approaching. It is regarding the final invoice for tonight's event. Our company policy requires the remaining balance to be cleared before we serve the dessert courses and pour the vintage champagne." I ran the credit card he provided on file, but it was completely declined. I tried running 2 backup cards he gave us earlier, and both of those were rejected by the bank as well. Imani's face flushed deep red. "Declined. That is impossible. My father is a millionaire. Your machine must be broken. Run it again." "I ran them 4 times each, ma'am," the manager pleaded, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper so the other guests would not hear. The bank flagged the accounts for insufficient funds. The total remaining balance for the custom menu, the imported seafood, and the premium open bar is $150,000. If I do not secure a valid payment method in the next 3 minutes, I am under strict orders from my corporate office to shut down the bars, turn on the floodlights, and instruct my staff to begin packing up the food stations. Please. I do not want to ruin the graduation party, but I need payment immediately." Imani stared at the man in utter shock. The color drained completely from her cheeks. The golden child was suddenly faced with the terrifying prospect of her perfect high society party being abruptly shut down in front of her wealthy new in-laws. She turned frantically to Spencer, gripping his arm. "Spencer, do something," she demanded, her voice pitching up in panic. "Pay the man. We will have Dad reimburse you tomorrow morning. Just give him your card so my friends do not see the caterers packing up the food." Spencer cleared his throat, his smug demeanor evaporating into thin air. He suddenly looked very small. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket, but his hand hesitated. $150,000, he repeated nervously. "Imani, honey, you know my assets are tied up in corporate escrow right now. I cannot authorize a personal transaction of that magnitude without liquidating a portfolio. My daily limit on this card is only $10,000. The great private equity savior suddenly could not save his own graduation party. The irony was exquisite. He stood there patting his pockets, sweating right alongside the catering manager, completely powerless. I smiled. A slow, genuine, relaxed smile. I uncrossed my legs, reached into my designer handbag, and pulled out a solid metal Centurion black card. I placed it gently on top of the leather billfold in the manager's shaking hands. "Run this," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "Clear the entire $150,000 balance and add a 20% gratuity for your staff. They have worked incredibly hard tonight." The manager stared at the heavy black metal card, his eyes going wide. He instantly recognized what it was. An invitation-only card reserved for the absolute top tier of the financial elite. He practically bowed. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. Thank you so much." He rushed off toward the kitchen as fast as his legs could carry him. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers, resting my elbows on the table, mimicking the exact power pose Spencer had used 5 minutes earlier. I looked at the two of them. Spencer was staring at the space where the black card had just been, his jaw slightly slack. He knew the financial requirements to hold that specific card. He knew it required a minimum annual spend that dwarfed his entire net worth. Imani just looked confused, entirely missing the magnitude of what had just happened. "What kind of fake credit card was that?" she scoffed, crossing her arms, trying desperately to regain her superiority. "You are going to get arrested for fraud, Nia. You cannot pay a bill like that with a stolen piece of plastic." Before Spencer could even formulate a response to Imani's ridiculous accusation of fraud, a sharp gasp cut through the smooth jazz music playing in the background. My mother Valerie materialized from the crowd like a storm cloud disguised in a custom-beaded evening gown. She had clearly been watching our table from a distance. She had seen the catering manager rushing over in an absolute panic, and she had definitely seen the heavy metal centurion card gleaming in my hand. Her chest was heaving beneath her silk neckline. The polite, radiant smile she had been wearing all evening for the society photographers had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. She did not look like a woman whose daughter had just saved her massive party from a humiliating financial disaster. She looked like a woman whose deepest, darkest secret was threatening to spill out onto the manicured lawn for all of Atlanta's elite to see. Valerie lunged forward, her fingers wrapped around my upper arm with the precision and brutal force of a steel trap. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug so deeply into my skin that I could feel the sharp biting sting through the thick silk of my emerald suit. "We are going for a walk," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying suppressed intensity. She did not wait for my response. She yanked me forward, dragging me away from table 14. I allowed her to pull me, my expression remaining completely neutral as we passed the bewildered faces of my distant relatives. As we navigated the edge of the sprawling party, Valerie forced a tight artificial smile onto her face. She nodded graciously to the church elders and waved at her sorority sisters as if we were simply two women stepping away for a private, loving mother and daughter chat. But her grip on my arm was bruising, a desperate, frantic attempt to maintain physical control over a daughter. She suddenly realized she could no longer mentally dominate. She dragged me past the glowing crystal chandeliers, past the catering tents, smelling of roasted lamb and truffle butter, and pushed me toward the dark, secluded edge of the property where the heavy security lights did not reach. The moment we were concealed behind the thick, towering privacy hedges, entirely out of sight from the billionaire guests and the local society reporters, Valerie dropped the loving mother facade completely. She spun around, her eyes blazing with a feral kind of rage. Without a single word of warning, she raised her hand and struck me across the face. The slap echoed sharply in the quiet darkness, the heavy diamond rings on her fingers scraping brutally against my cheekbone. The physical sting blossomed across my skin, a hot, radiating heat that rushed to my ear. 5 years ago, that exact same strike would have shattered me into a million pieces. 5 years ago, when she threw me out of this very house for failing a single class and wanting to build software instead of studying medicine. A slap like that would have brought me to my knees in tears. I would have begged for her forgiveness. I would have apologized for existing and ruining her perfect image. But tonight I did not even flinch. I did not raise a trembling hand to touch my stinging cheek. I did not look away. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, my breathing slow and measured, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, with nothing but cold, analytical detachment. "What is wrong with you?" she spat, her voice trembling with a rage so deep it made her entire body shake. "How dare you pull a stunt like that in front of Spencer's family? Where did you get that black card, Naya? Are you doing something illegal? Are you sleeping with some old rich white man just to get your hands on dirty money? Is that how you are surviving out there on the streets?" She paced back and forth in the shadows, her hands fluttering wildly in the air, her voice rising in a frantic, desperate crescendo. "You always want to ruin everything for your sister. You could never stand the fact that she is the smart one, the beautiful one, the successful one, the one who actually made something of her life. You have been a bitter, jealous failure since the day you dropped out of college and brought shame to our doorstep. Do you honestly think parading around with stolen money or sugar daddy cash is going to make me respect you? Do you think flashing a piece of metal makes you equal to the incredibly important people sitting at those VIP tables? You are a disgrace to this family's name, Nia. Valerie stepped closer, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with manic fury. I have spent decades building our impeccable reputation in this city. I sit on the executive board of our church. I am a legacy member of the most prestigious black sorority in the entire country. Your father is a highly respected businessman. We have worked our entire lives to project black excellence, to show the world that we belong in these elite circles. And you, the college dropout, the absolute embarrassment of a daughter we have to hide in the background so you do not humiliate us. You decide tonight is the night to play games. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. You think you can just buy your way into relevance? You think paying a catering bill makes you some kind of savior? You are nothing but a stain on this family. I want you to leave, right now. I want you to walk out the back gate, get into whatever cheap beat-up car you drove here in, and disappear before Spencer's parents realize who you really are. Go back to whatever pathetic life you are living, and stay away from us. She stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to crumble. She was waiting for the apology, the tears, the absolute submission that had always followed her vicious outbursts. She was waiting for the dumb one to bow her head and walk away in shame. Instead, I slowly raised my hand and brushed a stray lock of hair away from my face. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw entirely past the expensive designer dress and the flawless makeup. I saw a terrified, deeply insecure woman whose entire identity was built on a fragile, crumbling house of cards. I reached out and gently, but with undeniable dominant force, pushed her pointing finger down, brushing her hand away from my personal space. "Are you quite finished, Mom?" I asked, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. Valerie blinked, visibly stunned by my utter lack of reaction. The absolute calm in my voice seemed to unnerve her more than if I had screamed back at her. I did not pay that massive bill to show off. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to instinctively take a step back into the hedges. I did not pay it to embarrass Imani, and I certainly did not pay it to earn your respect. Your respect is utterly worthless to me now. I watched the deep confusion wash over her face, warring with her lingering desperate anger. She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her the chance. I paid the catering manager because he was exactly 2 minutes away from walking out onto that brightly lit stage, grabbing the microphone from Dad, and announcing to your prestigious church elders, your judgmental sorority sisters, and Spencer's billionaire parents, that the food service was being immediately terminated. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch between us, letting the cool night air chill the sudden sweat forming on her forehead. I watched her eyes dart back and forth as the reality of my words began to penetrate her manicured delusion. "I didn't pay to ruin your night, Mom," I said, leaning in slightly, my voice dropping to a surgical, devastating whisper. "I paid because Dad's credit card was just declined by the restaurant. And when they tried to run it again, it was declined a second time. All 3 of his premium backup cards were flagged for insufficient funds. The manager told me Dad's accounts are completely maxed out and frozen." I held her gaze, watching the absolute horror dawn in her eyes as I delivered the final crushing blow. "You and Dad do not have a single dime to your names. You are completely broke, aren't you?" My mother stared at me in the shadows of the garden, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, entirely unable to deny the truth of their absolute financial ruin. I simply turned on my heel, leaving her standing alone in the dark, and walked out the back gate of the estate. But in our family, a crisis is never allowed to disrupt a scheduled performance. Exactly 1 week later, I was summoned back into the lion's den. It was time for our traditional Sunday dinner. Growing up in the affluent black community of Atlanta, Sunday dinner was an institution. It was meant to be a time of warmth, connection, and spiritual grounding after church. In our house, however, it was a psychological battleground dressed up in fine china and sterling silver. The atmosphere in the massive formal dining room was so heavy and suffocating that it felt difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. If you were to track your eyes around the long mahogany table, you would see a masterpiece of culinary perfection masking a desperate reality. Platters of smothered chicken, golden baked macaroni, and cheese crusty around the edges, slow-cooked collard greens simmering with smoked turkey tails, and perfectly candied yams covered every inch of available space. Yet nobody was truly eating. The clinking of silverware against expensive porcelain echoed sharply in the oppressive silence. My father Marcus sat at the absolute head of the table carving the meat with aggressive, calculated precision. He was in his full Sunday best, still wearing his tailored suit from his morning duties as a senior deacon at our mega church. He loved projecting authority. He cleared his throat, utilizing that deep, resonant baritone voice he usually reserved for the pulpit and demanding tithes from the congregation. He began to preach. He did not speak to us, he delivered a sermon at us. He talked about unity. He lectured about how a strong Black family must operate like a closed fist, with all fingers tightly curled together to strike down any obstacles in this unforgiving world. He talked extensively about our legacy, about building a generational empire that the entire city of Atlanta would be forced to respect for decades to come. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the absolute necessity of putting the family name above personal desires. Nia, my father said, finally wiping his mouth with a monogrammed linen napkin and fixing his hard gaze directly on me. We have a highly critical business matter to conclude today. He reached into his thick leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his ornate chair and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He slid them smoothly across the polished wood until they rested right next to my dinner plate. Spencer has been gracious enough to help us restructure our family portfolio. Marcus continued, gesturing toward the white man sitting across from me. Spencer was currently swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, with a look of supreme self-satisfaction radiating from his pale face. In order to maximize our leverage and secure the best possible interest rates for our upcoming commercial development projects, we need to consolidate all physical properties under the primary family trust. It is basic asset management, Nia Spencer chimed in, leaning back in his chair and using that slow, deliberate tone people use when explaining simple concepts to a slow child. Your father has significant equity tied up in various disparate avenues. But to show my family's private equity board that the Marcus Washington estate has the required liquidity for our upcoming merger, we need to pool everything into one central holding company. That little property your grandmother left you down in the West End is currently a completely dead asset. By rolling it into the main corporate trust, we can leverage its equity immediately. It is the only logical financial move for the family's future. Exactly, Imani snapped, rolling her eyes aggressively as she picked at her greens. You dropped out of school, Nia. You have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate finance works. Spencer is doing Dad a massive favor by organizing this structural shift. The absolute least you can do is sign the paper so we can secure the capital we need. I am about to marry into a financial dynasty, and Dad needs his portfolio to look absolutely impeccable for the background checks. Do not be selfish and ruin this for me. I looked down at the heavy stack of paper resting next to my plate. The document on top was a quitclaim deed. It was a legally binding contract designed to transfer full ownership of my grandmother's house directly to my father's holding company. It was the only tangible asset I owned that they could not currently touch. The modest brick house was the exact place I had sought refuge in when they threw me out into the freezing rain 7 years ago. Now they wanted to strip that sanctuary away too, just to prop up their failing facade of extreme wealth. They were drowning in massive hidden debts, and they wanted to use my only home as collateral to secure another desperate loan. I did not reach for the expensive fountain pen my father had so helpfully placed on top of the contract. I slowly picked up my crystal glass of iced sweet tea, took a deliberate sip, and set it back down on the coaster. The ice clinked softly in the deafening silence of the dining room. I looked my father directly in the eyes, refusing to break eye contact. No, I said, my voice perfectly steady and quiet. Marcus completely froze. The heavy silver carving knife in his hand clattered loudly against the fine china platter. Valerie gasped, clutching her pearls in a highly theatrical display of maternal shock. "Excuse me, Marcus," rumbled the righteous deacon facade, instantly cracking to reveal the desperate cornered man underneath. "I am not signing over my house," I repeated, pushing the legal documents back across the table with my index finger. "You and Mom are drowning in debt. I know the truth, Dad. You have maxed out every single credit line you have access to. Your business accounts are overdrawn. I am not letting you use the only home I have left to secure another high-interest predatory loan that you can never possibly repay." Marcus slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table with such brutal, sudden force that the wine glasses toppled over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. He stood up, his heavy carved chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of purple with absolute unhinged rage. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own house?" he roared, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "I am your father. I am the head of this family. I bought that house you are living in. I paid for it with my own hard-earned money 20 years ago when your grandmother could not afford the mortgage payments anymore. That property belongs to me. I have every right in the world to take it back, and you will sign that paper right now." I did not flinch at his shouting. I did not cower the way I used to when I was a terrified college student. I reached calmly into my leather bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, the exact one Mr. Sterling had carefully prepared for me. I tossed it onto the center of the table, letting it land right on top of the spilled red wine. "You did not buy that house, Dad," I stated, my voice slicing through his screaming like an ice-cold blade. "You stole my life insurance money to buy it." The thick manila folder sat on the mahogany table, absorbing the spilled red wine like a sponge. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one drew a breath. The silence in the dining room was so absolute it felt like a vacuum pressing against my eardrums. Then the entire room erupted into absolute unhinged chaos. Marcus's face went from a dangerous purple to a sickly ashen gray, but he compensated for his sudden terror with sheer deafening volume. He slammed his heavy fists against the table again, making the fine china rattle and crash. He roared that I was a pathological liar, a deeply sick individual who had completely lost touch with reality. Valerie did not just yell. She practically lunged across the table, her perfectly coiffed Sunday hair flying out of place, her manicured hands grasping blindly at the air, as if she wanted to physically rip the words straight out of my mouth. "How dare you fabricate such disgusting, malicious lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, piercing pitch. "You forged those papers. You printed some fake documents off the internet because you are a sick, jealous girl who cannot stand to see your sister happy. You are trying to destroy this family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their screaming. I simply tapped my fingernail against the top of the folder. "Look at the federal notary seal, Mom," I replied smoothly. "Look at the bank transfer identification numbers. You cannot print certified life insurance payouts off the internet. You and Dad liquidated the policy Grandpa left for me when I turned 18, and you used it to buy Grandma's house through a shell company so no one would trace it." Imani slammed her hands over her ears, acting like a petulant child rather than a grown woman with a law degree. "Shut up!" she screamed, her face contorted in a massive, ugly scowl. "Just shut up and get out of our house. You are insane, Nia. You live in a dump, and you are just furious that Dad is a millionaire who just bought me a brand new Tesla and an Aspen estate. You are a broke, pathetic loser trying to ruin my life. Spencer, tell her to leave. Make her leave." But Spencer was not looking at Imani. He was not looking at me. While my parents were screaming and my sister was throwing a massive tantrum, Spencer had quietly reached across the table and pulled the wine-stained manila folder toward him. He was a private equity manager. He spent his entire life analyzing asset transfers, corporate structuring, and legal deeds. I watched his pale blue eyes scan the documents. I watched the exact second his brain processed the irrefutable legal proof of my father's massive financial fraud. The smug, superior smirk completely vanished from his face. He slowly closed the folder, pushed his chair back, and stood up. He physically took 2 large steps away from my father, treating Marcus like he was suddenly radioactive. Imani was still screaming, waving her diamond ring in the air. Dad bought me a $120,000 car with cash. He is rich. You are just a jealous liar. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating mother and locked eyes with my sister. You mean the pristine white Tesla currently parked in the circular driveway? I asked, my voice slicing through the chaotic room like an ice-cold blade. The one with the massive red graduation bow still sitting on the dashboard. Yes, the Tesla. Imani yelled, tears of absolute rage streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. The car that proves you are a delusional liar. I did not argue. I calmly reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, pulled up a specific application, and tapped a single, highly deliberate button. You are right, Imani, I said, keeping my gaze entirely fixed on her furious face. It is a beautiful piece of machinery. It has fantastic safety ratings and an incredible battery life. It is just a massive shame that you do not actually own it. What are you talking about? Marcus bellowed, his chest heaving as he tried to project his fading patriarchal authority. I bought that car, I hold the keys. Within seconds, the heavy, suffocating quiet of our elite suburban neighborhood was violently shattered. The piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens echoed down the tree-lined street, growing louder and more aggressive by the second. Accompanying the sirens was the heavy mechanical grinding of a commercial flatbed tow truck. Red and blue lights began flashing violently against the colonial brick walls of the house, strobing aggressively through the formal dining room windows, painting my parents' horrified faces in alternating colors of panic. Valerie froze, a sudden, breathy gasp escaping her lips. Marcus stumbled backward, his knees hitting his heavy carved chair. The entire family abandoned the ruined Sunday dinner, rushing frantically out of the dining room and spilling onto the grand front porch. I walked slowly behind them, entirely unbothered, stepping out into the warm Atlanta afternoon air, just in time to watch the absolute destruction of their flawless public image. 2 local police cruisers were parked at steep, aggressive angles across the bottom of our driveway, their light bars flashing brightly for the entire neighborhood to see. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck was actively backing up the pristine stamped concrete driveway, its reverse alarm beeping loudly, aiming directly for the white Tesla. What in the world is going on here? Marcus roared, charging down the front steps, waving his arms frantically. Stop that truck immediately. I am Deacon Washington. I demand you get off my property this instant. Do you have any idea who I am? 2 police officers stepped out of their cruisers, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. A 3rd officer holding a metal clipboard walked calmly up the driveway to meet my raging father. Are you Marcus Washington? The officer asked, his voice projecting a firm, no-nonsense authority that completely neutralized my father's blustering. Yes, I am, Marcus yelled, pointing at the tow truck operator, who was already attaching heavy metal chains to the Tesla's front axles. That is my daughter's vehicle. I purchased it 2 days ago. Tell him to unhook it right now, or I will have your badges. The officer did not even blink. He simply looked down at his clipboard. Sir, we are responding to a confirmed report of grand theft, auto, and felony identity fraud. This vehicle was not purchased with cash. It was heavily financed through a high-risk lender. And it was not financed under your name or your social security number. It was financed under the social security number of a Ms. Nia Washington. The blood completely drained from Valerie's face. She grabbed the porch railing to keep her legs from buckling. Imani let out a high-pitched hysterical shriek, clutching her graduation keys to her chest, as if holding them tighter would change reality. Are you Nia Washington? The officer asked, looking at my father with a raised eyebrow. I stepped smoothly past my trembling mother and walked down the brick steps. I am Nia Washington, I said, handing the officer my driver's license. And I did not authorize the purchase or financing of a $120,000 vehicle. The officer checked my ID, nodded respectfully, and signaled the tow truck driver to proceed. It was a brilliantly desperate move, I said, turning to face my father. My voice carried clearly across the manicured lawn. I wanted to make sure the wealthy neighbors, who were now stepping out onto their expansive porches and holding up their cell phones to record the spectacle, heard every single word. When you went to the luxury dealership, they probably laughed you out of the finance office. I continued watching Marcus physically shrink under the weight of his exposed crimes. Your business accounts are overdrawn. Your debt-to-income ratio is astronomical. Your personal credit score is completely radioactive. You could not finance a bicycle, let alone a luxury electric vehicle. So you did what any desperate bankrupt man trying to impress his wealthy future son-in-law would do. You used the clean, perfect credit of the daughter you threw away. You memorized my social security number, you forged my electronic signature on the binding loan agreements, and you stole my identity to buy a prop for your graduation performance. That is a lie. Marcus stammered, his voice weak, trembling, stripped of all its former power. I am your father. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, I corrected him coldly. I flagged the fraudulent account with the credit bureaus this morning. The lender canceled the contract immediately due to suspected identity theft, and the dealership dispatched the repo unit to reclaim their stolen property. The heavy mechanical winch on the tow truck whined loudly, lifting the front end of the pristine white Tesla off the ground. The massive red graduation bow slid off the dashboard and tumbled onto the concrete driveway, getting instantly crushed under the heavy tires of the tow truck. No, Imani screamed a guttural, terrifying sound. She threw herself onto the perfectly cut grass, kicking her heels and sobbing hysterically in her expensive Sunday dress. It is my car. I went to Harvard. I deserve it. Spencer, do something. Tell them to stop. But Spencer was not coming to her rescue. He had quietly slipped out the front door carrying his keys. He took one long, disgusted look at the repossession, the screaming fiancé on the lawn, the police officers taking statements, and the bankrupt father facing federal fraud charges. Spencer turned his back on Imani, walked briskly to his own luxury sedan, and drove away without looking back, completely severing his ties to our toxic, collapsing family. Marcus watched the tow truck pull the Tesla out into the street. He watched his wealthy neighbors whispering and pointing. He watched his future son-in-law abandon them. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed him. The man who had spent his entire life projecting untouchable power and wealth let out a hollow, defeated gasp. His knees buckled completely, and Marcus collapsed heavily into a wrought iron patio chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, entirely broken. You're entirely missing the point, Mom, I said, my voice cutting through her desperate rationalizations. This isn't just about a car. It's about you and Dad constructing a completely fraudulent lifestyle and expecting me to fund it without my knowledge. You didn't borrow my name. You committed multiple federal felonies. Valerie's face twisted, her tears drying up, instantly replaced by that familiar ugly mask of absolute indignation. Don't you dare talk to us about felonies, she spat, taking a step toward me, her finger jabbing the air. We are your parents. We raised you. We put clothes on your back and fed you when you were nothing. If your father needed to use your credit to maintain this family's standing, then that was your duty as a daughter. Family sacrifices for family, Nia. That is how this works. We protect our own. I let out a harsh, incredulous laugh that echoed off the brick facade of the house. Protect our own, I repeated, shaking my head. Where was that protection 7 years ago, Mom? Do you remember that winter? The winter I got severe pneumonia and missed 2 weeks of classes. I failed exactly one midterm because I was physically unable to breathe, let alone study. Valerie flinched, looking away, but I didn't let her off the hook. I came home coughing up blood, running a fever of 103, begging you just to let me sleep in my own bed for a few days so I could recover. I continued, my voice rising, vibrating with the suppressed anger of a decade. And what did you do? You and Dad stood right there in the grand entryway of this beautiful, pristine house and told me I was an embarrassment. You said a C average student had no place under your roof. You literally threw my suitcase out into the freezing rain and locked the door behind me. I had to walk 3 miles to a bus stop, sick and entirely alone, because my family decided my grades were more important than my life. Marcus looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumped, completely unable to meet my eyes. Imani was still sobbing quietly near the driveway, but she wasn't protesting anymore. "So don't stand there and preach to me about family sacrifice, Mom," I said, my tone turning dangerously calm again. "You sacrificed me the second I became inconvenient to your perfect image. You only want me to be family now because I am the only one with a credit score high enough to keep your pathetic charade afloat." Valerie's mouth opened and closed, her face cycling rapidly through anger, embarrassment, and a profound, terrifying realization that she had completely lost control. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had entirely inverted. She was no longer the matriarch handing down judgments. She was a desperate woman, caught in her own lies, standing exposed in front of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the tow truck disappearing down the street. It was a moment of profound reckoning, a physical manifestation of everything wrong with our family. And then Spencer cleared his throat. He had been standing near the edge of the porch, observing the entire scene with that infuriatingly calm, analytical expression he usually reserved for reviewing quarterly earnings reports. He adjusted his silk tie, shot a brief dismissive glance at Imani, who was still sniffling on the grass, and then looked directly at me. "All right, Nia, let's dial down the theatrics," Spencer said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone of a corporate negotiator stepping in to close a messy deal. "We understand you're upset. The situation with the car is unfortunate, and Marcus clearly overstepped. But screaming about it on the front lawn isn't productive." He took a step forward, placing himself physically between me and my parents, attempting to reclaim the narrative, to position himself as the rational, educated savior stepping in to handle the emotional, chaotic mess of his future in-laws. "If Marcus and Valerie are experiencing a temporary liquidity issue, there are professional ways to handle it." Spencer continued, his gaze patronizing. "Screaming about federal charges and towing cars only damages everyone's brand. Let's be pragmatic. You're holding the deed to your grandmother's house, a property that is clearly causing tension. My firm is looking to expand its real estate portfolio in this area." He offered a tight, perfectly calculated smile. "I'll tell you what I'll do. I will personally arrange for my firm to purchase that property from you for exactly twice its current market value. We will clear the transaction quietly off the books. Marcus can use those funds to immediately settle this car situation and restructure his debt, and you walk away with a significant influx of cash to support your whatever it is you're doing. It's a clean, quiet solution that benefits everyone. Let's let the people with actual financial literacy handle this problem." Spencer stopped dead in his tracks, his impeccably polished wingtips hovering just above the ruined grass. He slowly turned around, the condescending savior mask sliding back into place, completely undisturbed by the catastrophic meltdown of my parents' fraudulent empire. He approached the patio table, sidestepping my mother, who was now weeping softly against the brick column, and pulled a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket. He retrieved a folded document from his inner breast pocket, laying it out on the table with deliberate, exaggerated slowness. It was a purchase agreement, neatly typed, lacking only a signature. Imani instantly rushed to his side, throwing her arms around his bicep, practically burying her face in his jacket. "Spencer is going to fix this," she declared, her voice still hitching with sobs, but instantly regaining its arrogant edge. "He knows how to handle these kinds of complex financial situations. He is not going to let this ruin our wedding, Nia. Just sign the paper and let him take over." Spencer patted her hand, a sickening display of paternalistic affection. "Exactly, Nia," he said, his voice dropping an octave into that smooth, practiced tone of a seasoned negotiator talking down a ledge. "This is what we call a distressed asset scenario. Marcus overleveraged. It happens in these kinds of communities when people try to fast-track their wealth accumulation without the proper educational foundation. But my firm specializes in restructuring. We can buy the house, clear Marcus's immediate debts, and even set up a small, manageable trust for you. A modest stipend. You are, after all, an uncredentialed woman trying to navigate a highly complex economic downturn. Let my family's firm take this burden off your shoulders." He slid the silver pen across the table. It stopped inches from my hand. "Just sign on the dotted line," he murmured, "and you can walk away from this entire mess with a clean slate." I looked down at the contract. It was a standard purchase agreement, offering exactly $2.5 million for a property currently appraised at over $6 million due to the aggressive rezoning of the West End. It was a blatant predatory steal dressed up as an act of familial charity. I looked at the silver pen gleaming under the harsh security lights. Then I looked up at Spencer, his pale eyes completely devoid of empathy, burning only with the absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in the room. I picked up the contract. I did not reach for the pen. I held the thick legal paper in both hands, my fingers gripping the edges tightly. And then with a sharp, decisive motion, I ripped the entire document in half. The sound of the tearing paper was loud and startling in the sudden quiet of the yard. I stacked the two halves together and ripped them again, tossing the shredded pieces onto the patio table, right next to the silver pen. Imani gasped, pulling away from Spencer. "Are you completely insane?" she screamed, pointing at the shredded paper. "He is trying to save us. He is trying to save you." I ignored my sister entirely. My eyes locked on Spencer, watching the carefully constructed savior facade finally crack, revealing the absolute panic underneath. "Your firm is going to buy my house, Spencer?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying an undeniable crushing weight. "With what capital exactly?" Spencer stiffened, his jaw clenching. "I do not think you understand how corporate acquisitions work, Nia," he stammered, his smooth delivery suddenly failing him. "We have diversified holdings. We have liquidity." "You have absolutely zero liquidity," I stated, stepping forward, invading his personal space, forcing him to instinctively lean back. "You manage the Sterling Blackwood portfolio. I know exactly how your firm operates. In fact, I know exactly what your firm did on the 14th of last month." Spencer's eyes widened, the color draining from his face just as rapidly as it had drained from my father's. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Your firm is severely overleveraged in commercial real estate," I continued, my voice echoing off the brick walls, dismantling his entire identity piece by piece. "You made 3 massive, catastrophic bets on downtown office spaces right before the market collapsed. Your investors are panicked. Your board is panicked. And exactly 3 weeks ago, your father authorized an emergency high-interest bridge loan of $15 million just to make payroll and keep the doors open for another quarter." Imani stared at him, her tear-streaked face twisting in utter confusion. "Spencer, what is she talking about?" she demanded, tugging on his sleeve. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her your family is rich." Spencer did not answer her. He could not even look at her. He was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "How do you know that?" he whispered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its arrogant authority. "Those records are sealed. They are internal corporate documents. How could a college dropout possibly know about the bridge loan?" I did not answer him immediately. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a second manila folder, tossing it onto the patio table. It landed with a heavy thud right on top of his shredded contract. "Because I am not just a college dropout, Spencer," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. "I am the CEO of Apex Financial Analytics. We provide the algorithmic risk assessment software that the major banks use to evaluate high-risk loans. The bank you begged for, that $15 million, used my software to analyze your firm's desperate financial standing." I let that sink in, watching the realization hit him like a physical blow. And more importantly, I continued, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "I am the private investor who ultimately purchased that debt. I hold the note on your $15 million bridge loan, Spencer. Which means as of this exact moment, I practically own your family's entire firm." Spencer's entire carefully curated reality seemed to violently tilt on its axis. The perfectly manicured lawn, the towering brick columns of my parents' house, the flashing red and blue police lights reflecting off the neighborhood trees. Everything around him suddenly shifted into a sickening, disorienting angle. It was as if the ground had literally dropped out from beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. His pale skin flushed a blotchy, uneven crimson, and his throat bobbed aggressively as he desperately tried to swallow the rising tide of absolute panic. "That is impossible," Spencer stammered, taking a clumsy, uncoordinated step backward. His polished corporate mask had completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered boy playing dress-up in a tailored suit. "You are bluffing. You are a broke girl with no credentials. Apex Financial is a multi-billion-dollar tech firm. You do not run it. You do not own our debt. This is just another one of your pathetic, desperate lies to cause drama." I did not waste my breath arguing with him. I did not need to. I simply looked past his trembling shoulders, directing my calm gaze down the long, sweeping driveway. The flashing lights of the police cruisers briefly illuminated a sleek, jet-black Maybach pulling up right behind the idling tow truck. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. A tall, impeccably dressed older gentleman with silver hair and a sharp charcoal suit stepped onto the concrete. He held a thick, heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. It was Mr. Sterling, my lead corporate attorney, and the chief legal counsel for Apex Financial. He bypassed the confused police officers with a polite nod, his expensive shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement as he walked directly toward our chaotic gathering on the patio. "Right on time," I said softly, crossing my arms over my chest. Spencer spun around, his eyes locking onto the approaching figure. His breath caught audibly in his chest. He recognized Mr. Sterling immediately. Anyone operating in the high-stakes financial sector of Atlanta knew exactly who Arthur Sterling was. He was the legal executioner for the city's elite, a man who only appeared in person when billions of dollars or severe federal indictments were on the line. Mr. Sterling glided up the brick steps, his expression entirely neutral, completely unfazed by my mother weeping against the brick pillar or my father staring blankly into space. He stopped right beside me, snapping the latches of his briefcase open with two sharp metallic clicks. "Good afternoon, Ms. Washington," Mr. Sterling said smoothly, handing me a fresh stack of documents before turning his piercing cold gaze directly onto Spencer. "Mr. Blackwood, I am surprised to see you offering real estate buyouts today. I would have assumed your schedule was entirely booked with your emergency federal compliance meetings." Spencer opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy squeak came out. He looked frantically between me and Mr. Sterling, the remaining blood draining from his face, until he looked like a living ghost. "Would you like to do the honors, Arthur?" I asked, gesturing toward the terrified man in front of us. "He seems to be having trouble understanding the severe complexities of his own firm's financial ruin." "With pleasure," Mr. Sterling replied. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his nose. He began reading aloud, his deep, resonant voice projecting across the lawn with devastating surgical authority. "Sterling Blackwood Private Equity is currently under an active high-level investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for massive misappropriation of client funds. Your firm has been operating a sophisticated Ponzi structure for the last 3 years, using new investor capital to pay off old toxic debts. Your commercial real estate portfolio is entirely underwater. Your family's personal assets are leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. You lease your luxury cars. You lease your penthouse office space. You are by every legal and financial definition completely insolvent." Spencer took another step back, his hands shaking violently at his sides. "Stop," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Stop talking right now." But Mr. Sterling was merciless. He flipped to the next page, holding it up so the bold black text was clearly visible under the porch lights. "Furthermore, to avoid defaulting on your immediate payroll and masking the missing funds from the SEC auditors, your father authorized a high-risk predatory bridge loan of $15 million last month. A loan that was quickly sold on the secondary market and purchased in its entirety by Apex Financial Analytics. As my client, Ms. Washington, just stated, If you miss a single payment, which you inevitably will, she has the legal authority to seize every single remaining liquid asset your family possesses. The silence that followed was absolute. The myth of the wealthy old money Blackwood dynasty had just been atomized, scattered to the wind like cheap dust. They were not elite. They were not untouchable. They were nothing but desperate high-class grifters playing a dangerous game of fake it till you make it, and the game had just violently ended. They were facing crippling fines from the SEC and imminent federal prison time, and they had been scrambling for a lifeline to keep their sinking ship afloat. Imani was staring at Spencer, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The gears in her mind were turning, fighting through her own deep denial and massive entitlement, finally connecting the horrifying dots. She looked at his designer suit, his expensive watch, and then down at the massive diamond engagement ring currently weighing down her left hand. She slowly stepped away from him, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. "You," Imani stammered, her voice shaking with profound betrayal. "You pushed for a short engagement. You insisted we rush the wedding. You kept telling Dad that we needed to merge our family trusts immediately to maximize our tax benefits." "Imani, listen to me," Spencer begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "It is not what it sounds like. We can still fix this. We can restructure everything." Imani swatted his hand away, as if his skin were coated in battery acid. "You did not want me because you loved me." She gasped, the realization hitting her so hard she physically swayed on her high heels. "You wanted my family's money. You thought Dad was a multimillionaire. You were going to use my dowry to pay your debts. You were going to drain my accounts to save yourself from going to federal prison." The sheer accuracy of her accusation shattered the last remaining fragment of Spencer's sanity. The terrified cornered boy vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious cornered animal. If he was going down, he was going to take the entire Washington family down into the mud with him. Spencer let out a harsh, barking laugh, his face twisting into a cruel, unhinged sneer. He dropped all remaining pretenses of high society manners, glaring at Imani with absolute undisguised contempt. "Your dowry." Spencer mocked, his voice dripping with venom. "Your accounts. Wake up, Imani. Look around you. Look at your pathetic, bankrupt father sitting in that chair. Look at your mother crying over a car she just tried to steal. You think you are royalty. You think you are some kind of untouchable high society princess. You are nothing. Your family is a bunch of fraudulent rags, too." Imani flinched, tears welling up in her eyes again. "Shut up," she cried. "My dad is rich. He promised us the Aspen estate for our wedding gift." Spencer laughed louder, a manic echoing sound that made Valerie cover her face in deep, agonizing shame. "The Aspen estate," he yelled, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Marcus. "Ask him about the Aspen estate, Imani. Ask your rich daddy where it is. Because my firm did the background check on his assets 3 weeks ago when we started drawing up the prenuptial agreements. The $10 million mansion your dad promised you was foreclosed by the bank last month." Imani froze. She slowly turned her head, looking at Marcus. "Dad," she whispered, her voice fragile, begging for a denial. "Dad, tell him he is lying." But Marcus Washington did not look up. He sat paralyzed in his wrought iron chair, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of the quitclaim deed scattered across the patio table. He had nothing left to say. There were no more sermons to preach, no more lies to spin, no more authority to project. His entire empire of dirt had been washed away, leaving him completely exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. The absolute paralysis holding Marcus hostage shattered the second Spencer's arrogant words fully registered in his brain. The illusion was dead. The mutual con was exposed. And like two starving wolves realizing there was no meat left on the bone, the father-in-law and the son-in-law turned their fangs entirely on each other. Marcus shot out of his wrought iron chair with such explosive force that it tipped over and clattered against the brick patio. He lunged across the space separating them, grabbing the lapels of Spencer's custom-tailored suit. "You parasitic little fraud!" Marcus roared, his baritone voice cracking with unhinged fury. You came into my house drinking my liquor and eating my food, acting like you were Wall Street royalty. You are nothing but a broke white gold digger who thought he could use his privilege to infiltrate a hardworking black empire and drain my family dry. You targeted my daughter because you thought I would blindly write checks to save your failing, pathetic firm. Spencer did not cower. With his own reputation completely incinerated, the polished country club manners evaporated, revealing a vicious, entitled core. He violently shoved Marcus's heavy hands off his chest and shoved the older man backward. An empire. Spencer spat out a harsh, barking laugh tearing from his throat. Are you completely delusional, Marcus? You do not have an empire. You have a mountain of predatory loans and a closet full of expensive suits. You are a complete fake. You parade around this gated community and your megachurch acting like you are the pinnacle of high society, but you are nothing but a desperate fraud drowning in debt. You have been playing dress-up for years. Imani stood frozen on the lawn, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror as the two men she worshipped viciously dismantled each other. You promised my family a $5 million cash injection into our holding company. Upon the marriage, Spencer yelled, stepping aggressively toward Marcus. My father only approved this ridiculous wedding because you swore you had the liquid capital to stabilize our real estate portfolio. You lied to us. You promised us the Aspen estate as collateral. Because you swore your family's trust fund was worth $500 million. Marcus screamed right back, his face a mask of purple rage. You sat in my office and told me your private equity board would absorb my commercial debts the second you married Imani. I only agreed to pay for this $1 million wedding spectacle because I thought you were going to bail out my manufacturing firm. You do not have a dime. You are facing federal prison. You are a broke, worthless con artist trying to use my daughter as a human shield against the SEC. The sheer, ugly truth hung in the humid Atlanta air. They had both been playing the exact same high-stakes game of financial chicken. Marcus needed Spencer's old money reputation and supposed liquid wealth to save his drowning businesses. Spencer needed Marcus's flashy, self-made cash to plug the massive bleeding holes in his over-leveraged firm. Two desperate, bankrupt men, both trying to extract a fortune from the other, only to realize the vault was completely empty on both sides. Valerie let out a long, agonizing wail. It was not a cry of concern for her daughter's shattered engagement or her husband's collapsing health. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire social currency burn to ash. She slumped against the brick column of the porch, sliding down until she was sitting on the hard concrete, clutching her designer pearls as if they could somehow anchor her to reality. The church, Valerie sobbed, rocking back and forth. The neighbors. Everyone is watching. The police are in our driveway. The car was towed. Everyone is going to know. The ladies on the auxiliary board are going to feast on this. We are ruined, Marcus. We can never show our faces at Sunday service again. Deacon Washington is a fraud. I am ruined. My reputation is completely destroyed. Shut up, Valerie, Marcus snapped, whirling around to glare at his weeping wife. Just shut up and let me think. He reached up and violently yanked at his silk tie, loosening it around his thick neck as he paced the patio like a caged animal. He refused to look at the police cruisers still parked at the end of the driveway. He refused to look at Imani, who had dropped to her knees on the grass, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of my grandmother's quitclaim deed. Marcus was a man who had spent 3 decades bending reality to his will through sheer volume and intimidation. He was not ready to surrender. He stopped pacing and took a deep, ragged breath, physically forcing his broad shoulders back. He adjusted his suit jacket, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. He turned away from the weeping women and the furious, bankrupt son-in-law, fixing his bloodshot eyes directly on me. "You think you have won, Nia?" Marcus growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous gravelly register. "You think, because you wear a cheap suit and play with algorithms, that you can destroy me. You think exposing this little real estate problem changes who I am." I stood perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave deeper. "I built my company from the ground up. Marcus bellowed, his chest puffing out with desperate manufactured pride. I am Marcus Washington. Drowning in debt or not, I still own 70% of Washington Manufacturing. The brand alone is worth a fortune. I do not need this pathetic boy or his fraudulent private equity firm to save me. I do not need your grandmother's worthless house. I have options. Real options. High-level corporate buyers who actually understand the value of my legacy. He jabbed a finger in my direction, a triumphant manic gleam returning to his desperate eyes. I am selling the company, Marcus declared, proudly projecting his voice so the entire neighborhood could hear his supposed salvation. Vanguard Group, the largest asset management firm in the state. They sent a formal letter of intent to my office just last week. They are going to initiate a hostile takeover of my commercial debt and buy me out completely. It is a multi-million-dollar acquisition. They are going to clear my ledgers and leave me with enough capital to buy and sell you 10 times over. I am untouchable. The silence that followed his grand declaration was brief. I looked at his sweaty, triumphant face. I looked at Valerie, who had suddenly stopped crying, a tiny spark of greedy hope reigniting in her tear-filled eyes. I looked at Imani, who was slowly standing up from the grass, desperate to believe that her father was still the rich king he claimed to be. I tried to maintain a neutral expression. I really did. But the absolute poetic irony of his statement was simply too much to contain. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a small, polite chuckle. It was a loud, genuine, belly-deep laugh that echoed across the lawn, slicing through the heavy, dramatic tension like a chainsaw. I laughed until my ribs ached, until Marcus's triumphant smirk faltered and twisted back into pure, unadulterated confusion. The sound of my laughter hung in the heavy summer air, sharp and bright, cutting through the thick fog of their collective delusion. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His jaw slacked in a grotesque mask of confusion. He was waiting for me to stop, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the moment I would shrink back into the terrified, obedient daughter he had violently discarded 7 years ago. But that girl was dead. She had frozen to death on the 3-mile walk to the bus stop on the night he threw me out into the winter rain. I stopped laughing. The smile vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, impenetrable calm. I stepped forward, moving out of the periphery and directly into the center of the patio light. The visual focus of the entire yard seemed to shift entirely onto me, narrowing the world down to this exact point in space and time. Everyone else, my weeping mother clutching the brick pillar, my shattered sister kneeling in the grass, the wealthy neighbors still recording from their manicured lawns, simply faded into the dark, blurred background. You really think Vanguard Group, a multi-trillion-dollar global asset management firm, suddenly decided to swoop down and play savior to a failing mid-level manufacturing plant in Atlanta? I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. Do you truly believe a corporate giant woke up last week and felt a sudden burst of charity for a man drowning in high-interest debt and fraudulent commercial loans? Marcus gripped the arms of his wrought iron chair, his knuckles turning stark white. They sent a formal letter of intent, he repeated, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. It was on official letterhead. They offered a full buyout. They are going to clear my ledgers. They sent a letter of intent to broker a hostile takeover on behalf of a private client. I corrected him, taking another slow, deliberate step toward the mahogany table. Vanguard does not buy toxic debt for their own portfolio, Dad. They act as an intermediary. They execute aggressive acquisitions for anonymous private equity funds who specialize in distressed assets. They find bloated, failing companies run by arrogant men who are desperate for a lifeline, and they facilitate the execution. I turned my head slightly, not breaking eye contact with my father, and gave Mr. Sterling a subtle fractional nod. The attorney did not say a single word. He reached into his thick leather briefcase for the third and final time. He pulled out a heavy black leather folio, the kind reserved for final binding corporate acquisitions. He stepped forward and dropped it onto the exact center of the table. The heavy thud of the folio hitting the wood sounded like a judge's gavel coming down to deliver a final, inescapable sentence. These are the finalized Vanguard acquisition documents, Mr. Sterling stated, his voice a perfect emotionless baritone. The transfer of all commercial debt, intellectual property, and physical assets belonging to Washington Manufacturing, as well as the majority debt holding of Sterling Blackwood Private Equity. Everything is bound notarized and legally executed as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The humid air felt practically electrified. Then the sheer primal instinct of survival kicked in. Marcus and Spencer, the two men who had spent the last hour posturing as untouchable titans of industry, lunged for the black folio at the exact same time. It was a pathetic, disgusting display. They bumped shoulders, their hands grappling and slipping over the leather cover, pulling the heavy document back and forth like starving dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. Spencer managed to pry the cover open first, his pale, manicured fingers trembling violently as he flipped through the thick stack of legal parchment. Marcus leaned over him, his heavy chest heaving, his eyes frantically scanning the dense paragraphs of corporate jargon. They were searching for salvation. They were looking for the loopholes, the buyout clauses, the golden parachutes that would allow them to walk away from the wreckage of their fraudulent empires with their pockets full and their reputations intact. But there were no golden parachutes. The terms of the acquisition were brutal, surgical, and absolute. The anonymous distressed debt fund had not just purchased their debts, it had weaponized them. The fund now held total controlling interest over Washington Manufacturing and complete leverage over Sterling Blackwood Private Equity. Every bank account, every physical warehouse, every piece of manufacturing equipment, every corporate vehicle, and every outstanding client contract now belonged entirely to the acquiring entity. Valerie slowly stood up from the concrete, her hands trembling as she wiped the ruined mascara from her cheeks. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice fragile and laced with a terrifying realization. "Marcus, what does it say? Tell me we are not losing the house." Marcus did not answer her. I watched his eyes dart across the pages. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead and trace a slow, agonizing path down his cheek. I watched him physically struggle to pull oxygen into his lungs as he realized the true magnitude of his defeat. He was no longer the CEO of his own company. He was not even an employee. He was a tenant in a burning building, and the new landlord had just permanently locked all the exits. "Who is it?" Marcus gasped, his voice cracking into a high, panicked wheeze. He shoved Spencer aside, grabbing the final page of the contract with both hands. "Who is the private client? Who bought the debt?" His bloodshot eyes darted to the bottom of the page, searching for the signature of the principal investor, the faceless corporate titan who had just orchestrated the total annihilation of his life's work. He found the signature line. He stared at the blue ink resting boldly against the crisp white paper. He stared at it for so long I thought his brain had simply stopped functioning. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Marcus's hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The heavy legal document slipped from his grasp, fluttering down to the patio table to rest beside the spilled red wine and the shredded quitclaim deed. Marcus slowly lifted his head. He looked at me, his eyes completely hollowed out, stripped of every ounce of pride, arrogance, and authority he had ever possessed. His mouth opened, but he could not force the syllables past his lips. Spencer snatched the paper off the table, his eyes darting to the bottom of the page. He read the signature. He dropped the paper as if it had suddenly caught fire, taking 3 rapid, stumbling steps backward until his back hit the brick wall of the house. "No," Spencer whispered, his voice trembling with sheer unadulterated terror. "No, that is completely impossible. It cannot be you." Imani scrambled up from the grass, her graduation dress stained with dirt and grass. She ran to the table, her hands shaking as she picked up the document her fiancé had just dropped. She read the bold, looping ink at the bottom of the page. "Nia Washington, founder and Chief Executive Officer, Apex Financial Analytics." Imani let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She dropped the paper and backed away from the table, staring at me as if she were looking at a ghost. I reached down and calmly picked up the final page of the Vanguard acquisition contract. I held it up, letting the harsh security lights illuminate my signature for everyone to see. "Surprised, Dad?" I asked, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality that echoed across the silent yard. I took one final step forward, standing directly over him, casting a long, dark shadow that completely enveloped his trembling frame. "Your stupid, worthless college dropout daughter has been secretly running a highly aggressive distressed debt fund for the last 5 years," I stated, my words striking him like physical blows. "While you were maxing out predatory credit lines to buy designer suits and fund country club memberships, I was building an algorithmic empire in the shadows. While you were parading around the megachurch demanding respect you did not earn, I was quietly purchasing the toxic liabilities of failing arrogant men. I used the pain, the humiliation, and the absolute desperation you inflicted on me to build a financial guillotine. And today I finally dropped the blade." Marcus let out a ragged, choking sob, finally realizing the inescapable reality of his situation. He had nothing. No company, no leverage, no wealth, and absolutely no power. He was completely at my mercy. I tossed the signed contract back onto the table, right over the dark red wine stain. "I did not just buy your debt, Dad," I said, looking down at the broken man who had once been my father. "I just bought your entire lives." The air in the room didn't just grow thin, it turned into a vacuum. Marcus's face, which had been a map of arrogant denial only seconds ago, now looked like gray parchment. He was physically shaking, his gaze darting between me and the black leather folio as if it were a bomb ready to detonate. I didn't give him time to recover. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical register. "You still don't get it, do you, Dad? You and Spencer spent years playing a game of chicken with high-interest debt, assuming you could just leverage your reputation to refinance your way out of every disaster. You treated the economy like a casino, where the house always let you win because you were who you were. But the house changed, and you didn't notice. When you dumped your toxic commercial loans onto the secondary market 3 years ago, you didn't look at who was on the other side of that ledger." I gestured toward Mr. Sterling, who had retrieved a slim, digitized tablet from his briefcase. "Apex Financial didn't just stumble upon your debt, Marcus. We tracked it. We waited for the exact moment the market shifted and your credit ratings began to collapse. While you were planning this fake high society wedding to merge your bankrupt houses, my firm was systematically buying up every single note you signed. The bank didn't call you to warn you about the liquidity crisis because they didn't own your debt anymore. I did." Spencer let out a strangled hacking sound, his knees finally buckling as he collapsed into the chair Imani had vacated. His hands went to his head, pulling at his perfectly styled hair. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the floor, seeing the prison bars that were already closing in on his future. "And the Aspen estate," I continued, my voice cold as ice, "that wasn't a bank foreclosure. That was me. I bought the lien on that property 6 months ago, the moment it hit the distressed registry. You weren't holding that property in a family trust. You were holding it on a wing and a prayer, and I cut the tether." I turned my focus back to Marcus, who looked as though he had aged 20 years in the span of a single conversation. He tried to stand to summon that old booming authority, but his legs failed him. He gripped the back of the iron chair, his knuckles white, his eyes pleading. "Naya, please." He rasped the word, stripping away decades of performance. "Think about the family. Think about your sister. She knew nothing about this." I looked at Imani, who was still huddled on the ground, her face buried in her hands, her world reduced to the shards of a fake dream. Then I looked at Valerie, who had stopped crying and was now staring at me with a look of absolute terrified awe. Imani didn't want a family, Dad. She wanted a lifestyle, and you were more than happy to sell it to her by lying about everything I ever stood for. I walked over to the patio table and picked up the heavy cream-colored envelope that had been sitting there since the start of the evening, the one Imani had brought to show off her seating charts and guest lists. I tore the flap open, not with anger, but with the quiet precision of a surgeon. I pulled out a single embossed invitation and dropped it onto the table in front of Marcus. "You spent 20 years telling me I was the mistake, that I was the one who didn't understand how the real world worked. You spent every holiday dinner making sure I knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of your success. Well, here is your reality. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the final document. It wasn't a contract and it wasn't a bank statement. It was a formal notice of default and eviction. You have 72 hours to vacate this property, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. Everything you are standing on, the furniture, the art, the very ground this house is built on, belongs to Apex Financial. And as for your manufacturing firm, Mr. Sterling has the liquidation orders ready for the board meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You aren't just broke, Marcus, you are finished. Marcus let out a low, guttural moan, his head sinking into his chest. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets and the frantic, shallow breathing of the people I had just dismantled. You have to be joking, Spencer managed to wheeze from the chair, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You can't just evict us. We have connections. We have people. You have a federal investigation, Mr. Sterling stepped in, his voice cutting off Spencer's rambling, and my client has an entire legal department that has been preparing for this specific moment for 5 years. The silence in the room was heavier than the mahogany table itself. Marcus, still clutching the edge of the furniture to keep himself upright, stared at the check. It wasn't just the sheer scale of the number $50 million that paralyzed him. It was the crisp, undeniable legitimacy of the funds. This wasn't drug money or some offshore shell account loophole. This was a structured, verified capital injection from a Tier 1 Wall Street powerhouse, signed over to me with the casual ease of a billionaire paying a lunch bill. The check hit the polished wood with a sharp, definitive slap. Look closely, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a razor. That is the initial tranche from Vanguard's minority stake in Apex Financial. They didn't just want to buy your debt. They wanted to partner with the woman who owned the keys to your entire kingdom. They bought into my vision, not your broken promises. Imani, who had been scrambling to gather the scattered remnants of her dreams, stopped dead. Her eyes drifted from the check to my face. The expensive, meticulously applied makeup on her cheeks was streaked with desperate, confused tears. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of superiority, of being the chosen one, the one who would inherit the throne of the Washington name. Now, she was staring at the person she had spent years bullying, realizing that I had been playing a game she hadn't even known existed. She let out a choked, ragged sound, her knees finally giving way. The heavy silk of her designer gown bunched around her on the floor, the fabric staining against the dirt of the patio. She looked less like a bride-to-be and more like a discarded doll. 50 million, she whispered the number, sounding foreign on her tongue. You really had it all along. Valerie didn't wait for Imani to finish. She was already in motion, her knees hitting the stone patio with a thud that echoed the sickening finality of the moment. She scrambled toward me, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at the hem of my dress, her expression a terrifying, jagged mask of desperate maternal performance. Nia, my sweet, precious Nia. Valerie sobbed, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch. Mommy always knew. I always told your father Nia is the brilliant one, the one with the hidden fire. I was just protecting you, darling. You know how volatile the business world is. I didn't want you to be exposed to the stress until you were ready. She reached up, trying to cup my face with her trembling, jewelry-laden hands, but I stepped back, the movement precise and cold. Con Mom, I asked, my voice devoid of empathy. You spent 7 years calling me a mistake. You spent every holiday dinner making sure I knew I was an unwanted accessory in this perfect house. Valerie didn't flinch. She simply pushed harder, her desperation making her bold. You were just testing us, right? You wanted to see if you could survive on your own. And look at you. You've surpassed us all. You're our miracle, Nia. You're the savior of this family. You're going to help us, aren't you? You won't let your father go to prison. You won't let your sister lose everything. You'll buy back the firm, won't you? I looked down at her, at the woman who had presided over my erasure, who had watched from the sidelines, while my father dismantled my self-worth piece by piece. She was a master of the script, always shifting the blame, always finding a way to make her own cowardice seem like a necessary sacrifice. I reached down and pulled my hem from her grasp, the silk sliding away from her fingers like water. She let out a soft, pathetic gasp, but I didn't stop. I walked back toward the table where Mr. Sterling was already packing the files into his briefcase, his work here finished. "I have an agreement for all of you," I said, addressing the room at large. Marcus straightened, hope flickering in his eyes like a dying candle. He was clinging to the idea that I was still his daughter, that blood would override the brutal clinical reality of the contracts lying on the table. "What kind of agreement?" Marcus asked, his voice gravelly and stripped of its former bluster. I pulled a crisp single-page document from the folder Mr. Sterling held out to me. It wasn't a complex legal brief. It was a simple, one-sided ultimatum. "You sign these releases, waiving all future claims to Washington Manufacturing and any association with Apex Financial, and I will handle the liquidation of the firm in a way that minimizes your personal criminal exposure." I said, my tone as flat and professional as a balance sheet. "I have already contacted the SEC. I have an internal audit ready that separates your personal negligence from the corporate restructuring. If you sign, the prosecutors see a man who was misled by his board and a bad market. If you refuse, I personally hand over the file that details how you knowingly funneled corporate funds into personal real estate, including the Aspen House." Marcus went deathly silent. He looked at the paper, then at the check for $50 million, and then at me. He was calculating his own survival. He knew exactly what was in those files. He knew that I had been tracking his financial indiscretions for longer than he had been planning his own retirement. Valerie was still on the ground, her face a portrait of shattered pride. She looked at Marcus silently, pleading with him to take the deal, to just take the exit I was offering, before the world finished tearing them apart. "You're really going to just walk away?" Marcus said, his voice quiet, almost lost. After everything, I walked to the edge of the patio, looking out at the neighborhood that had once been the center of my world, the place where I had been expected to be the submissive, invisible daughter. "I'm not walking away, Dad," I said, looking back at them one last time. "I'm finally leaving. There is a pen on the table. Sign it or don't. But by morning, the ownership stakes for this house, the company, and the debt will be fully processed. I suggest you start packing." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't wait to see who would pick up the pen first. I had already won the only thing that ever mattered. I had secured the truth, and in doing so, I had stripped them of the only thing they valued, the ability to lie to themselves. As I turned toward the driveway, leaving the wailing, the excuses, and the broken dreams behind, the silence of the night felt like the first clean breath I had taken in 7 years. The era of the Washington performance was officially closed, and the real life, the one I had built in the shadows, was finally loudly mine. The heavy, oppressive silence on the patio was shattered by Amani's shrill, frantic scream. She scrambled to her feet, her designer gown stained with the dirt of her parents' backyard, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. She looked at me, then at the documents on the table, and finally at Spencer, who was currently clutching the table's edge as if it were the only thing keeping him from physically disintegrating. "You are a demon!" "Nia," Amani shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "You have been waiting for this. You have been sitting in the shadows watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to burn everything to the ground. You want to tear me away from the man I love. You want to destroy our wedding because you are bitter. You are nothing but a spiteful, lonely sociopath." I didn't blink. I didn't even flinch at the venom in her voice. I just looked at her. My sister, who had spent the better part of a decade making sure I knew I was an outsider in my own home, and felt a strange, cold clarity. "I'm not destroying your wedding, Amani," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with the precision of a scalpel. "You destroyed your own life the moment you decided that your social standing was worth more than the truth. The man you love." I gestured toward Spencer, who was visibly sweating, now his eyes darting toward the driveway as if calculating a way to sprint to his car. "Ask him one more time who he is and why the federal authorities are looking for him. Ask him if he still loves you when he's sitting in a federal holding cell watching his bank accounts get liquidated." Spencer didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on the open folio, his hands twitching at his sides. He was already gone, his mind a million miles away, desperately calculating how to pivot his own survival away from the mess we were currently standing in. "I agree," Spencer blurted out, his voice sharp and jagged. "Imani, we are done. I am done." He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, stripped of all arrogance. "I will sign the release. I will walk away today. Just please, Nia, I am begging you, do not notify the SEC. Give me 48 hours to clear my personal offshore accounts. I will give you the equity, the firm, everything. Just keep the federal investigators away from me." Imani looked at him, her entire expression crumbling. The man who had spent months whispering sweet promises of high society life in her ear was now actively bartering her away to save his own skin. "Spencer," she whispered, her voice failing. "You said we were a team. You said we were going to build an empire." "There is no empire," Spencer snapped, his voice harsh and dismissive as he pushed past her, not even bothering to look back. "There is only a sinking ship, and I am not going down with it." I turned my attention to Valerie, who had stopped her frantic crawling. She was staring up at me, her eyes hollow, her mouth hanging slightly open as she realized the sheer weight of the price I was demanding. Standing before the entire congregation on Sunday, Valerie whispered the words sounding like a death sentence. "You want me to stand up in front of the auxiliary board, in front of the pastor, in front of the entire community that has looked up to us for 30 years and tell them that my husband is a fraud and we are bankrupt? You might as well kill me, Nia. My life is that reputation." "Then consider it a transformation," I replied, my tone icy. "You've spent 3 decades curating a persona that was built on a foundation of lies and status seeking. Now you get to experience the truth. You will stand there on Sunday, you will tell the truth about the bankruptcy and the fraud, and you will apologize to the people you have been grifting for years. That is the only way I keep the liquidation private. That is the only way Marcus doesn't spend his golden years in a state prison." Marcus let out a strangled, low sound, his head dropping into his hands. The weight of it all, the foreclosure, the acquisition, the public humiliation, was finally pinning him to the earth. He knew. He knew he had no other option. He had spent his whole life posturing as a titan, and now he was being dismantled by the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like a ghost. I looked at my watch, then back at the trio. 24 hours. I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more attention than any shout. The house, the cars, the jewelry, everything that was bought with corporate debt and investor fraud will be surrendered to the receivership by this time tomorrow. You will leave with 1 suitcase each. If I find that you've taken so much as a single piece of heirloom silver, I will revoke the offer and hand the entire audit to the federal prosecutor immediately." I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was calmly snapping his briefcase shut. "Everything is prepared," Mr. Sterling said, looking at Marcus with clinical detachment. "The evacuation orders are attached to the release forms. Your signatures are required on every page." Marcus slowly looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the fire of his arrogance completely extinguished. He looked at the check for $50 million, my check, and then at the release forms which spelled out his total, humiliating surrender. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it, but he managed to force the nib against the paper, signing his name in a messy, jagged sprawl. Valerie and Imani followed suit in a daze, their movements robotic and disconnected, as if they were acting out a tragedy they hadn't realized was their own. When the final page was signed, I took the document from Mr. Sterling and tucked it into my bag. "It's over," I said, looking at them one last time. "The house is quiet. The stage is empty, and the show has finally been canceled." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward my car, the sound of the tires crunching against the gravel as I drove away. I didn't look back at the broken family standing on their soon-to-be-evicted property. I didn't look back at the flashing lights or the neighbors peering through their curtains. I just drove, watching the city lights blur into a streak of color, feeling the cold, sharp truth of my own power. I hadn't just won. I had rewritten the rules entirely. The sharp, echoing crack of Imani striking Spencer across the face sounded like a gunshot in the humid night air. The physical impact jerked his head violently to the side, leaving a stark, crimson handprint blooming across his pale cheek. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of the strike froze everyone on the patio. Imani stood over him, her chest heaving, the heavy layers of her designer engagement dress trembling as she stared at the man who had just traded her future for his own legal immunity. "You miserable coward!" Imani shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams, completely devoid of the polished, breathy tone she usually reserved for high society events. "You are going to cancel our wedding to save yourself. You are going to humiliate me in front of 500 guests. I gave you everything. I convinced my father to open his ledgers to you." Spencer did not cower this time. He slowly touched his stinging cheek, his pale eyes narrowing into a glare of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged forward, grabbing Imani by the wrist and violently shoving her backward. She stumbled, her high heels catching on the stone pavers, and collapsed hard onto the patio floor. The delicate imported silk of her gown tore against the sharp edge of a planter box, the fabric ripping with a loud, sickening sound. "You gave me nothing but a massive liability," Imani Spencer spat, standing over her with a look of absolute disgust. "You are a vapid, spoiled liability who brings absolutely zero value to the table. You thought you were marrying up. You thought I was your golden ticket into the elite circles of Atlanta because your father's fake money could never buy you real respect. Well, congratulations. You get to keep your fake money and your bankrupt father. I am taking the deal. I am leaving this pathetic charade behind, and I suggest you learn how to fly commercial." Spencer did not wait for her to respond. He turned on his heel, his expensive leather shoes crunching against the gravel as he practically sprinted down the long driveway toward his leased sports car, abandoning his disgraced fiancée in the dirt without a single backward glance. Imani let out a guttural, tearing scream, beating her fists against the stone patio. She looked absolutely feral, the pristine golden child completely shattered her perfect illusion of a billionaire romance, reduced to public humiliation. But her screams were immediately drowned out by the sudden vicious eruption of my mother. Valerie Washington scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild and bloodshot, her perfectly styled hair falling in ragged strands across her face. She did not rush to comfort her weeping, discarded favorite daughter on the ground. She bypassed Imani entirely, marching directly toward Marcus. She stopped inches from his face, her chest heaving with a rage so toxic it seemed to poison the very air around her. "You ruined me!" Valerie screamed, her voice vibrating with a hysterical, terrifying pitch. "You promised me an empire, Marcus. You swore to me that the manufacturing firm was expanding. You sat in the front pew of our church, taking the praises of the entire congregation, acting like you were a titan of industry. And you are nothing but a broke, pathetic liar." "Valerie, lower your voice!" Marcus hissed, holding his hands up in a desperate, futile attempt to pacify her. "The neighbors can hear you. The police are still down the street. We can restructure. I can talk to the board." "There is no board left to talk to, you absolute fool!" she shrieked, slapping his hands away with violent force. "Did you not just hear your own daughter? She owns us. She owns the house. She owns your failing company. Tomorrow morning, every single woman on the auxiliary committee is going to know that Valerie Washington is being evicted. They are going to know the cars are repossessed. They are going to know my designer bags were bought on credit. We cannot pay back. I have spent 30 years building my reputation in this city. I have smiled, I have hosted, I have played the perfect corporate wife, and you have flushed it all down the drain for your own arrogant, stupid pride." Marcus staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The booming, intimidating patriarch who had spent his entire life dominating every room he entered was completely gone. He collapsed heavily into his iron patio chair, wrapping his thick arms around his head, burying his face in his knees. He let out a low, pathetic moan, rocking back and forth as the reality of his total financial and social annihilation finally crushed the breath from his lungs. Valerie was relentless. She stood over him, kicking the leg of his chair, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns of the gated community. "I am not standing in front of that congregation on Sunday and confessing to fraud," Valerie screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the back of his head. "I will not be the sacrificial lamb for your failures. I will not let those women look at me with pity. You fix this, Marcus. You fix this right now, or I swear to God I will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back." I stood near the edge of the patio, perfectly still, watching the scene unfold before me, like a beautifully directed stage play. I did not need to say another word. I did not need to raise my voice, present another document, or issue another threat. The Washington family was executing my revenge for me. They were tearing each other to pieces, stripping away the thin, expensive veneers of their high society masks to reveal the greedy, hollow, vicious strangers underneath. The father who demanded absolute obedience was cowering in a chair. The mother who valued social status above her own children was screaming like a cornered animal. The golden child sister who believed she was entitled to the world was weeping in a torn dress on the dirty ground abandoned by a man who only wanted her non-existent trust fund. It was the ultimate, undeniable truth. They had never loved each other. They had only loved what the others could provide for their own selfish, manufactured images. And the second the money vanished, the second the illusion was shattered, their familial bonds dissolved into absolute hatred. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. The suffocating weight of my childhood, the years of enduring their insults, the countless nights I spent believing I was the flawed broken one in a house of perfect people, it all simply evaporated. I was not the broken one. I was the only one who was real. I adjusted the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder. I turned my back on the chaos, stepping off the patio and walking slowly across the immaculate lawn toward the driveway. The sounds of their fighting faded into background noise, a meaningless, chaotic soundtrack to my final departure. I reached the edge of the driveway, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. The cool night air felt incredibly clean. Nia Valerie screamed, her voice cutting through the night, shrill and dripping with absolute desperate panic. I stopped, but I did not turn around. I simply stood there listening to the frantic, heavy footsteps of my mother running across the grass behind me. She stopped a few feet away, her breath hitching in her throat. "You cannot do this," Valerie gasped, her voice trembling with the realization that I was actually walking away. "You cannot leave us here like this. We are your blood. I am your mother. You walk out that door right now, Nia. You walk away from this property, and I swear to you, you will have no family." I did not even break my stride. I raised my right hand, giving a lazy, dismissive wave over my shoulder without bothering to turn around. The heavy oak door of the mansion slammed shut behind me with a violent, echoing crack that vibrated through the humid night air, cutting off my mother's frantic screaming in an instant. The harsh sound of the slamming wood perfectly matched the sleek metallic chime of the private elevator doors sliding open. I stepped out of the mahogany-paneled elevator and into the expansive, silent sanctuary of my downtown penthouse. The transition was seamless. The chaos, the screaming, the pathetic, desperate threats of the Washington family were entirely gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the city glittering hundreds of feet below my floor-to-ceiling windows. I dropped my leather bag onto the pristine marble kitchen island. Right next to it sat the certified bank draft from Vanguard, $50 million. It was just a piece of paper, lightweight and unassuming, yet it held the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. I walked over to the velvet sofa, the exact spot where I had been sitting when my brother-in-law first sent that arrogant, mocking text message a lifetime ago. I picked up my crystal glass, the dark red wine still breathing perfectly inside, and took a long, slow sip. The vintage tasted like absolute victory. I sank into the plush cushions, letting the profound silence of my home wash over me. It is a strange, jarring sensation to realize that you have officially orphaned yourself. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, that family is an unconditional sanctuary, no matter how toxic the environment becomes. For 27 years, I had internalized that lie. I had allowed my father to measure my worth against his fraudulent balance sheets. I had allowed my mother to treat me like a defective accessory that ruined her perfect social aesthetic. I had allowed my sister to use my perceived failures as a stepping stone to elevate her own fragile ego. They had demanded a scapegoat to carry the weight of their own insecurities, and I had played the part perfectly, until I decided to stop reading their script. The aftermath of that night played out exactly as I had orchestrated. True to my brutal ultimatum, the Washington Empire collapsed with a whimper rather than a bang. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, Mr. Sterling executed the hostile takeover of both Washington Manufacturing and Sterling Blackwood Private Equity. Spencer was stripped of his titles, his assets, and his corporate immunity, left completely exposed to the federal auditors who descended on his leased offices before noon. Imani, stripped of her diamond ring and her illusion of high society royalty, was forced to quietly cancel a $1 million wedding without a single explanation to her furious bridesmaids. But the true masterpiece of my retribution occurred on Sunday morning. I did not attend the service, but Mr. Sterling kindly ensured that a legal associate was sitting in the back pew to record the event. Valerie Washington, a woman who had spent 30 years worshiping at the altar of public perception, walked up to the podium of our megachurch. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a plain, unassuming dress. Without the safety net of my father's fake wealth, she stood before the 500 people she had spent her life judging and manipulating. With a trembling voice and a face devoid of makeup, she confessed to the entire congregation that her family was bankrupt, that their lifestyle was a fraud, and that they were vacating their home by nightfall. The horrified gasps from the auxiliary board ladies were loud enough to be picked up by the microphone. They left the mansion with exactly one suitcase each, just as I had demanded. They moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, utterly exiled from the glittering superficial world they had sacrificed their own daughter to inhabit. I did not send them to federal prison. I simply locked them inside a prison of their own making, stripping them of their masks and forcing them to live with the ugly, unvarnished truth of who they really were. I took another sip of wine, looking out at the sprawling, illuminated grid of the Atlanta skyline. The city looked different to me now. It was no longer a terrifying maze of closed doors and exclusive clubs designed to keep me out. It was a chessboard, and I was the one moving the pieces. If you are watching this and you are sitting in a room where you are constantly made to feel small, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I know exactly how much it hurts to look around a dinner table and realize that the people who share your DNA do not share your heart. I know the crushing, suffocating weight of being the family disappointment, the black sheep, the one whose dreams are dismissed as foolish delusions, while the golden child is showered with unearned praise and limitless resources. When you are trapped in that toxic dynamic, your first instinct is always to fight back with words. You want to scream, to argue, to justify your choices, to beg them to see your value. You exhaust yourself trying to translate your worth into a language they refuse to speak. Stop explaining yourself. Stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your words will never change their minds because their rejection of you has absolutely nothing to do with your flaws and everything to do with their own fragile egos. They need you to be the failure so they can pretend to be the successes. Take all of that agonizing pain, take all of that boiling anger, and forge it into absolute, unbreakable discipline. Let them call you a disappointment. Let them call you stupid. Let them mock your clothes, your job, and your quiet life. Give them the gift of their own ignorance. While they are busy performing for the crowd, pouring their energy into fake smiles and rented luxury, you need to retreat into the shadows. Work in absolute silence. Build your foundation brick by invisible brick. I remember the nights I spent sleeping on a cheap mattress on the floor, eating canned soup while watching my sister post photos from luxury vacations funded by my father's stolen money. I remember the sheer, blinding rage that fueled me through 18-hour workdays writing code until my eyes blurred and my fingers ached. I channeled every insult, every condescending smirk, and every slam door into my software. Educate yourself. Take the risks they are too cowardly to take. Save your money, sharpen your skills, and construct an empire they cannot even begin to comprehend. The road will be incredibly lonely. There will be nights when you question your own sanity, nights when the silence of your isolation feels deafening. But that isolation is not a punishment. It is a protective fortress. It gives you the space to grow without their toxic interference pulling you back down into the dirt. Do not seek revenge by tearing them down with petty arguments. Seek revenge by ascending so high that they look like ants from your balcony. When the time is right, you will not need to raise your voice. You will not need to throw a tantrum or stage a dramatic scene. You will simply place the undeniable crushing weight of your success right in front of them, and you will let the bank draft speak on your behalf. There is a unique, exquisite purity in watching the people who treated you like a peasant suddenly realize you own the entire kingdom. I lost my family that night, but the truth is, they were never really mine to begin with. What I gained was infinitely more valuable. I gained absolute, unshakable sovereignty over my own life. I woke up the next morning knowing that every dollar in my account, every square inch of my penthouse, and every ounce of respect I commanded in the corporate world was earned entirely by my own hands. I owed them nothing. I owed the universe nothing. I only owed myself the promise to never let anyone diminish my light again. They threw me to the wolves and I returned leading the pack. Sometimes losing a toxic family is the only way to truly find yourself. For years, I allowed their insults to dictate my worth, believing I was the disappointment they claimed I was. But the hardest lesson in life is realizing that your value is never determined by those who refuse to see it. Never let anyone convince you that you are foolish or unworthy. Instead of arguing, step back into the shadows, work relentlessly, and build your own empire. When the time comes, let your undeniable success speak for you. If you have ever been underestimated or discarded by your own family, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your story in the comments below, because the absolute sweetest revenge is your massive success.